call. I know you guys are going to want to come build it.
Desperate investigators stepped into the cluster of homes in a small Canadian village and immediately stopped cold. Pots of food sat untouched. Clothes lay half-finished with needles still threaded, and sled dogs hung lifeless on their ropes. A grave had been opened, with its stones perfectly arranged, yet there was no body inside. Every sign suggested a community that should have been alive and thriving, but not a single person remained. No footprints led away. No evidence explained the silence. What they found that day was not the aftermath of disaster, but the imprint of a population that had simply vanished, leaving behind one of Canada's strangest mysteries. Now experts have finally solved this mystery. The real truth is shocking, and it's not what you think.
They did find traces of radiation on their clothes. Oh, we just lost the sled! This is a document that shouldn't exist. Are you okay?
Joe Labelle's story was unsettling and hair-raising.
The day Joe Labelle walked into silence. Snow crunched under Joe Labelle's boots as he moved through the icy terrain. The cold bite at his face with every step, but he pressed on without hesitation. He had crossed this region before and knew its rough patterns and rhythms. It was November 1930, and the trip should have been routine. He was heading to an Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni, expecting shelter, trade, and familiar faces. Instead, what he found would leave him shaken for the rest of his life. As he approached the village, something felt off. He heard nothing at all. There was no barking, no chopping of wood, no laughter in the distance. The silence felt unnatural, too complete for any functioning village. Settlements in the north never greeted you this way. Usually, sled dogs would raise the alarm before your boots even touched the edge of the trail. Children would shout, someone would call out, and smoke would drift from the chimneys. This time, nothing moved, and no one called back. The wind was the only frightening sound. He stepped into the heart of the village and saw that every home stood upright and untouched. Nothing was burned, nothing appeared broken, and no doors had been forced open. Yet not a single person came out to greet him. Labelle called into the air repeatedly, but his voice only echoed back at him. He began checking the homes, and each one told the same story. Fires had gone cold. Pots sat undisturbed with frozen stew still inside. Clothes were folded or left half-sewn on tables, and teacups had frozen where they stood. There was no sign of violence, no blood, and no indication of panic. It looked as if the villagers had simply walked away in the middle of their lives and had never returned. Behind the homes, the silence turned far more disturbing. He found the village's sled dogs, each one still tied up and each one dead. The animals had starved, their bodies frozen in place. In the north, sled dogs were essential to survival. They were never left behind, and this was more than unusual. It was deeply wrong. At the edge of the village, Labelle discovered something stranger still. One of the graves had been dug up, yet the stones around it remained perfectly arranged. There were no signs of dragging, no claw marks, and no footprints around it. The body was gone, and whoever had taken it had done so carefully and with purpose. Labelle stepped back and left immediately. He made his way to the nearest telegraph station and contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, reporting everything he had seen. He described the frozen homes, the dead animals, the disturbed grave, and the complete disappearance of every man, woman, and child in the village. When the RCMP arrived, they found the scene exactly as he had described. But instead of answers, they found only more questions. The mystery deepened further when a journalist published a chilling version of the story, only for her report to vanish just as quickly as the people it tried to explain. Emmett Kelleher's article and the pulled story theory. The first report of the Anjikuni disappearance did not come from a police file or a government bulletin. It came from a journalist named Emmett Kelleher. In 1930, Kelleher published an article that detailed the eerie account told by Joe Labelle, describing what he had seen at the Inuit settlement. Her piece was the earliest known attempt to document the event publicly. It described not a massive village, but a small and isolated camp. That detail, though minor on the surface, would later be twisted and exaggerated, giving the story a larger-than-life shape that never matched the original report. Kelleher wrote clearly that the camp had been abandoned in a way that made no sense. Homes stood untouched. Food was left uneaten. Dogs had died, still tied to their posts, and a grave had been opened without signs of a struggle. She echoed Labelle's shock and confusion, reinforcing the idea that something deeply wrong had taken place in a remote part of the Canadian wilderness. But despite the article's chilling content, no follow-up stories appeared in major newspapers, and Kelleher herself never returned to the subject again. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. The article received early circulation, but was never widely distributed beyond its initial run. Within weeks, it had vanished from public discussion. No editorials expanded on it. No other journalists picked it up. There was no rebuttal or clarification. It was as if the story had been swallowed before it could spread. That silence is what gave rise to what is now known as the pulled story theory. Some believe Kelleher's report was not ignored, but actively buried. According to this idea, someone stepped in quickly and told her to stop. Whether it was government officials, military contacts, or private interests remains unclear. The theory suggests the village did not simply vanish by some unknown event. It was removed from record on purpose, because the truth behind it was something the public was not supposed to see. People have speculated about forbidden rituals, government experiments, and unexplained phenomena that could not be allowed to surface. What made the theory even more disturbing was that no one involved ever publicly addressed the report's disappearance. The article was not retracted, corrected, or updated. It simply ceased to exist in the public eye. That kind of silence, following a story that intense, did not feel like disinterest. It felt like deliberate suppression. With the press falling quiet, the job of finding the truth passed to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Their official investigation began soon after, but instead of solving the mystery, they walked into something even stranger. The RCMP investigation that raised more questions than answers. When Joe Labelle sent his message to the nearest telegraph station, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police responded quickly. They took his account seriously, and within days a team was dispatched to the isolated settlement near Lake Anjikuni. The officers made the difficult journey north through the frozen terrain, arriving with the expectation that there would be some logical explanation for what Labelle had reported. What they found instead confirmed his every word and added even more disturbing details to the growing mystery. The village was exactly as Labelle had described. The homes stood untouched. All belongings were present, and nothing of value appeared to have been taken. It did not look like an evacuation or an emergency. It looked like life had simply stopped. The sled dogs were found just as he had said, still tied to posts and dead from starvation. The officers noted that the animals had been left behind without any chance of survival, something that no one in the north would ever do without an urgent reason. This detail alone caused serious concern. It implied that whatever had happened had either been so sudden that no one had time to act, or had involved circumstances so unusual that even the most basic survival instincts had been abandoned. The most unsettling discovery was the grave. It was as if the grave had been opened and emptied by something that left no trace behind. During their time in the region, several RCMP officers reported seeing strange lights in the sky. These lights were described as pulsing and blue, unlike the typical green and white patterns of the aurora borealis. What made the reports unusual was not just the color, but the way the lights moved. They hovered and shifted in ways that defied explanation, sometimes rising and falling or drifting silently across the horizon. The officers noted these occurrences in their logs, but could not determine what they were or whether they had any connection to the missing villagers. Despite a full search of the area, the RCMP found no tracks, no campsites, and no living person from the village. There was no sign of disease. There was no indication of a struggle or attack. There were no answers. Every effort to reconstruct what had happened came back empty. The trail ended where it began, in silence. As word of the investigation spread, the public response shifted. With no explanation from the authorities, people began to fill in the blanks themselves. Speculation took hold, and new theories emerged. Some tried to find logic in the facts, while others gave in to darker, stranger ideas. Some were desperate guesses, others were terrifying. Theories that tried and failed to explain it all. One of the most disturbing was called the Wendigo spiral. It drew from indigenous legend, though twisted through outsider interpretation. The Wendigo was said to be a spirit of hunger and madness. It thrived in isolation. It entered the mind slowly. One person would begin to change, to grow paranoid, to crave something darker than food. In some versions of the story, they turned on their family, driven by something beyond human reason. Then others followed, not by choice, but as if caught in a spreading sickness. The Wendigo took the body and hollowed it out, leaving only a virulent shell. In this theory, the village did not disappear peacefully. It tore itself apart, then walked into the wild, ashamed of what it had done and too far gone to return. The silence left behind was not the absence of life. It was a place stained by horror. Another theory became known as the false sky god theory. It began with the blue lights. They were not just strange to witnesses. They were wrong. They pulsed and drifted and moved without pattern. In this belief, the villagers saw the lights and did not fear them. They welcomed them. Some thought the lights were signs from ancestors or spirits. A ritual may have been performed to greet them. But what arrived was not something meant to be worshipped. It was something else entirely. The result, believers say, was not violence or death, but a complete removal. The village had not been destroyed. It had been taken or shifted out of reality, pulled from one state of being into another that no human could follow. Everything had remained except the people. Equally unsettling was the mass pact theory. This version suggested that the villagers had not been harmed or lured. They had left willingly. Some say they believed the world was ending. Others claim they thought a gateway had opened. The signs were everywhere. Dogs left tied up. Meals left cooking. No supplies packed. The grave had been opened not by thieves, but by people preparing to bring the dead with them. In this view, the disappearance was not panic, it was preparation. They believed they were crossing over, and they made peace with it. Whatever they expected on the other side, it was worth leaving everything behind. Other explanations emerged over time, but none held up to scrutiny. Some claimed a disease had swept through the village, but there were no bodies and no symptoms left behind. Others said a sudden snowstorm had forced a panicked evacuation, but that did not explain the dogs or the meals or the lack of tracks. Alien abduction became a popular theory in fringe circles, supported only by the strange lights and the absence of everything else. Some even suggested a military experiment had gone wrong, followed by a cover-up. No documents or witnesses ever supported that claim. A few turned back to Inuit folklore, pointing to creatures like the Kalupalik, beings said to live beneath the ice and pull victims under without warning. Those legends were old, but they had never described an entire village vanishing. Then came the theory that nothing supernatural had happened at all, that the people had moved, that it was all misunderstood. But that raised an even deeper question. If no supernatural force was involved, how did everything disappear so cleanly? Why were the most basic signs of life still frozen in place? Why would an entire community leave without a single trace, a single message, or a single person remaining to explain it? Each theory explained a piece of the mystery, but none explained all of it. Each had gaps, contradictions, or a reliance on belief that stretched too far from the known. As the years passed, what had started as a report of an empty village grew into something more. It became a legend that spread across borders and generation. How the world became obsessed with Anjikuni. When the first reports of the empty Inuit settlement appeared in regional papers in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, the story spread with alarming speed. Readers were shocked, and newspapers quickly realized the value of a headline that suggested an entire community had vanished, without explanation. From small columns in local outlets, the story moved to larger Canadian publications, and then it crossed borders. Within months, American papers were running features, and European magazines picked it up as a symbol of the strange and unknowable North. It was no longer a local mystery. It had become international news. The more it spread, the bigger it grew. Writers and editors added details that were never in the first reports, shaping the story into something larger and more frightening. Some claimed that hundreds of people had gone missing, far beyond the small camp originally described. Others wrote of entire graveyards being unearthed, even though Labelle and Kelleher had only ever mentioned a single grave. Once the rumor reached wider audiences, corrections no longer mattered. The world wanted a ghost story, and Anjikuni gave it one. By the mid-20th century, the tale was firmly embedded in the growing culture of the unexplained. Books dedicated to mysteries and conspiracies retold it, often inflating the details further. Documentaries in the 1970s and 1980s brought it to television, presenting it alongside stories of alien abductions and haunted landscapes. Yet, as the story grew, so did skepticism. Investigators who looked closely at the sources began to notice cracks. Joe Labelle, the man who claimed to have discovered the empty village, had no record of a trapping license before 1930, which raised questions about his credibility. Emmett Kelleher, the journalist who published the first article, was allegedly known for sensational reporting. According to sources, some of her previous stories had relied on exaggerated claims. Some even claimed the photograph she used to illustrate the Anjikuni article was later proven to be decades out of date, showing people who could not possibly have been connected to the incident. In 1931, the RCMP had already quietly closed their files on the matter. Their official statement dismissed the entire story as a fabrication. For the authorities, the case was over. For the public, it had only just begun. The clash between the official silence and the powerful legend kept the story alive for decades to come. But if Anjikuni was nothing more than a fabrication crafted by a trapper and a reporter, why did its details mirror so many genuine abandonment events in Canadian history? Why did it look similar to Canada's real vanishing villages? The ghost towns that were real and strangely familiar. Anjikuni was not the only place in Canada where life appeared to stop without warning. Across the country, entire towns had been emptied and left behind. These places were not mysteries in the supernatural sense, but they carried an atmosphere that fed the legend of Anjikuni and made it believable. When the public heard of a vanished village, they already knew that ghost towns were real. One of the most striking examples was Antioch, British Columbia. Once a thriving mining boomtown,
they put all the dynamite away from the mine and away from the town, and then in between the railway tracks it was easy access, so we're kind of a ways away from the town, away from the thing. Big steel door there.
Antioch collapsed in the 1930s after its copper industry fell apart. The end came quickly. Residents packed what they could and left in waves, abandoning houses, offices, and entire streets. When urban explorers later visited, they found frozen scenes of daily life still intact. Meals had been left on tables. School books remained in classrooms. Personal effects, from furniture to photographs, had been sealed away by the advancing wilderness. Antioch looked as though people had left one morning expecting to return, and never did. The effect was unsettling, and for many it felt as if the town itself had been swallowed by silence. Far from the Pacific coast, another example could be found in Ontario during the 1950s. Known today as the Lost Villages, these were communities that were deliberately evacuated and submerged during the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Churches, homes, and entire cemeteries were left beneath the water. Families were relocated, but the places they had once called home simply disappeared from the landscape. Divers who explored the drowned villages later described a haunting sight of intact buildings beneath the surface, preserved like memories sealed in glass. For Canadians, these villages became part of local ghost lore, reinforcing the belief that entire communities could vanish from existence in ways that were both sudden and final. In the far north, the pattern took a different form. Inuit and First Nations camps were often abandoned as families moved seasonally with hunting routes and the migration of animals. To outsiders who did not understand these traditions, such movements looked like abrupt disappearances. Camps left mid-use could appear frozen in time, with food, tools, and clothing scattered about. What was normal for indigenous groups appeared inexplicable to visitors, and over time, those misunderstandings became stories of vanishing. These real ghost towns and deserted camps show why the Anjikuni story resonated so strongly. Canada was filled with places where human presence had once thrived and then collapsed into silence. The lines between fact, memory, and myth were easily blurred, and people were willing to believe that one more village had slipped into mystery. But if the past could be explained through economics, construction, or seasonal migration, modern technology was supposed to provide certainty for Anjikuni. Instead, when researchers returned with new tools, the mystery only deepened.
Who searched the area but found no trace of the villagers. And that was the end of the story as reported by Kelleher.
When technology failed to solve the mystery, when a small research team returned to the Anjikuni region with modern tools, they expected to cut through the rumors and finally establish what had happened. Instead, the technology revealed almost nothing. Digital surveys of the lake and surrounding land produced no sign of a settlement that matched the descriptions in the reports. The soil showed no disturbances consistent with large-scale grave movements. The instruments used were capable of detecting faint changes in ground structure, yet the readings came back clean. It was as though the village had never been there at all. The team used remote sensing techniques, including drone-mounted scanners, to search for remains of hearths, post holes, or foundations. These were the markers archaeologists typically relied upon to confirm older habitation sites. Only minimal evidence was recovered, and none of it suggested a large, permanent community. Instead, what appeared were faint traces that were more consistent with temporary camps. To some researchers, this hinted that if people had once lived there, they had not settled long enough to leave a lasting physical footprint. Forensic specialists pushed further, using satellite imaging and cross-referencing with historical maps. Their findings only reinforced the problem. No indicators of a village appeared in the scans, no patterns of building structures, no remnants of a graveyard, and no signs of sustained activity could be detected. What remained was not proof of life, but the absence of it. Every modern tool sharpened the same picture. There was nothing to find. The conclusions of the team were circulated only in limited academic circles and never reached the wider public. Skeptics who reviewed the findings noted that if anything had existed, it had likely been a small nomadic camp rather than the larger settlement described by Labelle and reported by Kelleher. With no physical remains, the idea of an entire village seemed less and less credible. Yet, the absence of evidence did not erase the mystery. It only deepened it. How had so many consistent details been described if the place itself had never existed? The more science was applied, the more the story dissolved into uncertainty. Technology did not close the case. It only revealed an unsettling void. But historians who turned to Inuit oral tradition began to find something else. A story with no aliens or spirits, but one that was still haunting and heartbreaking. And now they have finally explained the mystery, the final interpretation. The more historians peeled away at the Anjikuni mystery, the more they began to see something disturbingly clear. There was never a vanished village, but there had absolutely been a village. That was the most dangerous part of all. Anjikuni Lake was a real place. Trappers and travelers did visit it. Indigenous camps did exist along its shoreline. That part had always been true. But the vanishing, the mass disappearance, the opened graves and meals still warm, that was the fiction. And the reason it spread so far was because it never needed to be invented from nothing. It had roots in reality. Modern researchers combing through archival reports, land use records, and old maps found that what likely existed in the 1930s was a seasonal camp or nomadic stop used by Inuit families. They came and went with the weather. When someone like Joe Labelle arrived and found it empty, the mistake wasn't what he saw. It was what he believed it meant. He was unfamiliar with the seasonal migration of the people who lived there. He saw absence and assumed tragedy. Emmett Kelleher, the journalist who ran with the story, made it even worse. He described the site with haunting detail, but left out critical context. That context had never been hidden. It had simply never been understood. But the most important factor wasn't even what was seen at Anjikuni. It was what people had seen elsewhere. Canada was full of real vanishings. In the same era, the mining town of Antioch had been abandoned nearly overnight. Meals were left on tables. School books were frozen in time. A whole town collapsed under economic weight and was never recovered. In Ontario, the lost villages had been swallowed by water during the St. Lawrence Seaway construction. Cemeteries, churches, homes, all drowned beneath government projects, their names erased. Travelers still report seeing rooftops beneath the waves. These real disappearances laid the perfect psychological groundwork. People already believed that villages could be erased. So when Anjikuni's story emerged, it did not sound impossible. It sounded inevitable. That is what gave it power. That is what made it feel real. The final interpretation offered by the historians who investigated Anjikuni is not supernatural and not comforting. It is that folklore filled in where facts were absent. A story grew to explain something unfamiliar, then found fertile ground in a country already haunted by real disappearances. The blue lights? Possibly auroral activity. The opened grave? Perhaps a misremembered or misunderstood local burial. The missing people? Not gone, just somewhere else. Anjikuni did not vanish, but something very real did happen. A moment of confusion turned into a myth because it aligned too well with other truths, and for decades, no one questioned it. In the end, The most terrifying part was not what happened to the village. It was how easily we believed it had disappeared. What do you think about the Anjakuni mystery? Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Want more videos like this? Then subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. See you in the next video.